There are two victims in this story. That is the first thing you need to understand before any of it makes sense. There is the young woman who was killed in her apartment on a June night in 1996, whose life was taken from her in an act of savage violence before she had barely begun to live it. And there is the young man who was sitting in a prison cell for 20 years for a crime he did not commit, whose life was also taken from him, not in a single brutal moment but in the slow grinding erasure of 2 decades behind bars. 2 victims. 1 killer. And a system that failed both of them so completely, so catastrophically, that the story of what happened in Idaho Falls, Idaho should be required reading for everyone who believes that justice in America always finds its way to the truth. It did not find its way here. Not for a very long time. And by the time it did, the damage was irreversible. Angie Dodge was 18 years old in the summer of 1996. She had recently moved into her own apartment in Idaho Falls, one of those milestones of early adulthood that feels enormous when you are living it, a first real space of your own, a first real taste of independence, the particular pride of having a key to a door that is yours. She was young in the way that 18 is always young, which is fully and completely and without the benefit of knowing yet how fragile everything is. She had her whole life in front of her. She had plans and friends and the entire open expanse of what was coming next. Idaho Falls sits in the high desert of eastern Idaho, a city of roughly 50,000 people in 1996, a place where the Snake River bends through the landscape and the Mormon Tabernacle anchors the downtown skyline, and people tend to know their neighbors in the easy, incidental way that mid-sized American cities allow. It was not a place where young women in their own apartments expected to be unsafe. It was not that kind of place. And then June 13, 1996 happened, and in a very specific way, it became that kind of place, at least for Angie Dodge, at least on that particular night. She was found in her apartment. She had been raped. She had been stabbed multiple times. The violence done to her was extreme, and it was intimate, meaning close range, meaning the person who did this was physically present with her in her own home for the duration of it. She was 18 years old. She should have been safe in her apartment. She was not safe. And what was done to her in that apartment was so completely wrong and so completely devastating that it is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind without flinching. Her mother, Carol Dodge, became one of the central figures in the story that followed, not because she chose to be, but because when the system that was supposed to find her daughter's killer instead found the wrong person and imprisoned him, Carol Dodge refused to accept it. She fought for 20 years. She fought for her daughter, and she fought for the man who she came to believe had been wrongly convicted in her daughter's name. Her persistence is one of the most remarkable threads in a story full of remarkable and terrible things. The investigation in the immediate aftermath of Angie's murder was conducted by the Idaho Falls Police Department. DNA evidence was collected from the crime scene. Biological material was recovered that would, if properly analyzed and compared, point directly to the killer. This is the kind of evidence that should have resolved the case cleanly and quickly, the kind of evidence that the modern forensic era was built on, the promise that science could cut through confusion and ambiguity and identify the truth with precision. The DNA did not match the man who was eventually charged with the murder. That fact is worth pausing on. The DNA evidence, collected from Angie Dodge's own apartment, from her own body, never matched Christopher Tapp. Not once. Not at any point in the investigation or the prosecution or the 20 years that followed. The biological material left by Angie's killer pointed at a person, but that person was not Christopher Tapp. This was known. It was in the evidence record. And Christopher Tapp was convicted anyway. Christopher Tapp was 19 years old when Angie Dodge was killed. He knew her casually, in the way that young people in a community often know each other without being close. He was part of a social circle that overlapped loosely with Angie's world. When investigators began focusing on her social connections in the weeks after the murder, Tapp became someone they looked at. What followed was one of the most documented examples of coercive interrogation in modern American criminal justice. Tapp was brought in for questioning multiple times. The interrogations were lengthy and high pressure. Investigators used techniques that are now widely understood to produce false confessions, including the presentation of false evidence, the suggestion that cooperation would produce leniency, the wearing down of a young person's resistance through extended psychological pressure over multiple sessions. Tapp was young and not particularly sophisticated about his legal rights. He did not have robust legal support at the most critical moments. And eventually, under sustained pressure, he produced a confession. The confession was inconsistent with the physical evidence in numerous ways. It changed across multiple sessions. Details that Tapp provided did not match the crime scene. And critically, the DNA evidence recovered from Angie's apartment did not match Tapp's DNA. The science was saying clearly and unambiguously that Christopher Tapp was not the man who raped and killed Angie Dodge. He was convicted in 1998. He was sentenced to a fixed life term. He went to prison. The wrongful conviction of Christopher Tapp is a case study in how the criminal justice system can fail when the pressure to close a case overrides the obligation to find the truth. Investigators wanted to solve Angie Dodge's murder. That desire was understandable and in some ways admirable. The community wanted answers. The family wanted answers. The pressure to produce a suspect and a conviction was real and significant. But the desire for closure cannot be allowed to override the evidence. The pressure to convict cannot be allowed to substitute for proof. When it does, two people are victimized instead of one. Angie Dodge did not get justice from Christopher Tapp's conviction. She got the appearance of justice. She got the performance of closure without the substance of it. Her actual killer was not in prison. He was free. He was alive and free and living his life while a young man who had not hurt anyone was locked away in a cell. Carol Dodge spent years following the case, reading the evidence, talking to advocates and attorneys and forensic experts, and arriving at a conclusion that was both devastating and clarifying. She did not believe Christopher Tapp had killed her daughter. The DNA evidence was the linchpin of her conviction. She understood, with growing certainty, that the biological material recovered from the crime scene pointed to someone else, and that someone else was still out there. This is an extraordinary position for a murder victim's mother to take. The social and emotional pressure to accept a conviction, to allow the closure that the criminal justice system is offering you, is enormous. The alternative, acknowledging that the wrong person is in prison and that the actual killer was never caught, means reopening everything. It means fighting a system that has already decided it has the right answer. It means years of advocacy in the face of institutional resistance. Carol Dodge chose that path. She chose it for her daughter and she chose it for Christopher Tapp, and she sustained that choice through years of setbacks and frustrations and moments when it must have seemed impossible that it would ever lead anywhere. The Innocence Project, the organization founded to investigate and challenge wrongful convictions, became involved in the case. Attorneys and advocates examined the evidence. The DNA question was central to everything. The presence of unidentified biological material at the crime scene, material that clearly belonged to someone other than Christopher Tapp, was the foundation of the argument that an innocent man was in prison. The path to exoneration was long and complicated. The legal system does not easily reverse its own decisions. Courts are resistant to reopening convictions. The standard for overturning a verdict is high, and it should be high, but that standard can also function as a barrier to correcting genuine errors. Tapp's attorneys fought through the legal system year after year, pressing the DNA issue, pressing the coercion issue, pressing the fundamental argument that a man was in prison for a crime the physical evidence said he did not commit. In 2017, more than 20 years after Angie Dodge was killed, Christopher Tapp's sentence was commuted by the governor of Idaho, allowing for his eventual release. He walked out of prison after 20 years. He had gone in as a 19-year-old and he emerged as a middle-aged man, with 2 decades of his life gone, 2 decades that could not be given back, 2 decades that represented the full span of a young adulthood and the beginning of what should have been a mature life, all of it consumed by a prison sentence for a murder he did not commit. He was fully exonerated in 2019. The exoneration happened in part because of what else happened in 2019, something that changed the trajectory of the case and produced the answer that had been missing for 23 years. Investigative genetic genealogy, the forensic technique that builds family trees from DNA evidence to identify suspects, was applied to the biological material recovered from Angie Dodge's apartment. This technique, which had recently been used to identify the Golden State Killer in California, had demonstrated that cold cases with unidentified DNA could be cracked through the patient construction of genealogical databases and the tracing of family relationships. The DNA from Angie's crime scene was uploaded to a public genealogical database. Investigators worked with genetic genealogy specialists to build out the family tree attached to that biological material. They identified relatives who had submitted their own DNA to genealogy services. They mapped the family connections, narrowed the candidate pool, and eventually arrived at a name. Brian Leigh Dripps. Dripps had lived across the street from Angie Dodge in Idaho Falls in 1996. He had been her neighbor. He was there, on that same block, visible from the very apartment where Angie was killed, through the entire period when investigators were looking for a killer and then through the years when an innocent man sat in prison for what Dripps had done. He watched. He continued to live his life. He moved out of Idaho eventually, relocating to Caldwell, Idaho. He got on with things. He was free. When investigators arrived at his door in 2019 as a result of the genetic genealogy work, they asked him to provide a DNA sample. He did. His DNA matched the biological material recovered from Angie Dodge's apartment in 1996. The science was definitive and unambiguous. This was the man who had raped and stabbed Angie Dodge. This was the man who had been living across the street from her when he did it. This was the man who the DNA had been pointing to all along, while the wrong man sat in a prison cell and the right man remained invisible. In 2020, Brian Leigh Dripps confessed. He admitted to entering Angie Dodge's apartment on the night of June 13, 1996. He admitted to what he had done to her. He admitted to the rape and the stabbing. He admitted to all of it. The confession came 24 years after the crime, 22 years after an innocent man was convicted, and years after Christopher Tapp had lost 2 decades of his life to a prison sentence built on a coerced confession and prosecutorial momentum that overrode the evidence. Dripps was charged with first-degree murder and rape. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The nature of Dripps as a neighbor, as someone who was geographically present throughout the investigation, who lived on the same street, who would have been visible to detectives as they came and went from the crime scene, who existed in the physical landscape of the investigation without ever being seriously examined, is one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. He was there. He was proximate. And in the chaos of an investigation that was already moving in the wrong direction, he was simply not seen. This is not uncommon in wrongful conviction cases. When investigators focus on a particular suspect, the surrounding landscape tends to fade. The tunnel vision that produces false confessions also produces investigative blind spots, areas that go unexamined because the case is already being built in a different direction. Dripps benefited from exactly this dynamic. The investigation fixed on Christopher Tapp and it stayed fixed, and the man across the street remained exactly where he was, untouched. What does it mean to think about Brian Leigh Dripps living across the street from the apartment where he murdered a young woman, watching the investigation unfold, knowing that another man was being looked at, knowing that the pressure was pointing away from him? The psychological portrait of someone who can do that, who can sustain that level of concealment across years and then decades, who can watch a wrongful conviction proceed and not come forward, is profoundly disturbing. He knew Christopher Tapp was in prison for what Dripps had done. He knew. And he stayed silent. That silence is its own category of moral horror, distinct from the original crime but connected to it in a way that compounds the damage. Every year that Tapp sat in prison was a year that Dripps's silence actively perpetuated an injustice. It was not passive. It was a daily renewed choice to allow an innocent man to remain imprisoned. Christopher Tapp was 19 when he went to prison. He was in his early 40s when he walked out. The years in between are not abstractions. They are real, specific, irreplaceable years. They are years of a young adulthood that was not lived. Years of relationships not formed or formed in the impossible context of incarceration. Years of professional development that did not happen. Years of ordinary life, the small freedoms of choosing where to go and when to eat and what to do on a Tuesday afternoon, years of all of it, gone. No amount of exoneration or compensation or public acknowledgement restores those years. They are gone with the same finality as if they had been taken by physical violence. The state of Idaho has a mechanism for compensating individuals who are wrongfully convicted, but the compensation available under such mechanisms is never commensurate with what was taken. How do you place a dollar value on 20 years of a human life? How do you calculate the cost of the loss of your 20s, your 30s, the decade in which most people build the foundation of everything they will have in the rest of their lives? The mathematics of compensation for wrongful imprisonment is always inadequate because what was taken cannot be replaced, only partially acknowledged. Carol Dodge, who fought for so long for both her daughter's true justice and for Christopher Tapp's exoneration, has spoken publicly about the particular grief of this case, the way it contains multiple layers of loss and multiple categories of wrongdoing. Her daughter was murdered. The man accused of murdering her was innocent. The actual killer lived across the street. The system failed at nearly every level. And yet she kept going. She kept pressing. She kept believing that the truth was reachable and that reaching it mattered even after 2 decades had passed. The role of genetic genealogy in resolving this case cannot be overstated. The technique represents a genuine revolution in cold case investigation, and the Angie Dodge case is one of its most significant success stories, in the specific sense that it not only identified a killer but simultaneously confirmed the innocence of a man who had been wrongfully imprisoned. The same DNA that convicted Dripps exonerated Tapp. The science resolved both halves of the injustice in a single analytical moment. The broader implications of genetic genealogy for cold cases are significant and still unfolding. There are thousands of cold case files in law enforcement databases across the United States that contain unidentified biological material, DNA that belongs to killers who were never caught, collected from crime scenes decades ago and sitting in evidence rooms waiting for the technology to become available that can translate them into names and faces and addresses. That technology now exists. It is being applied. Cases that seemed permanently closed are being reopened and resolved. The ethics of investigative genetic genealogy are genuinely complex and deserve to be engaged with seriously. The technique works by accessing databases populated by ordinary citizens who submitted their DNA for genealogical purposes without necessarily anticipating that their genetic information might be used to identify a criminal relative. The privacy implications are real and significant. But so is the human cost of unresolved murders and wrongful convictions. The Angie Dodge case puts a face on both sides of that equation, and it does not simplify easily. What it does illustrate, with painful clarity, is the cost of the alternative. Without genetic genealogy, Leigh Dripps might never have been identified. Christopher Tapp might have remained in prison or, having been released on commutation, might have lived the rest of his life with the cloud of an unvacated conviction. Angie Dodge's murder might have remained officially unsolved or officially solved in the wrong way forever. The technique, with all its complexity and its legitimate privacy concerns, produced a result that justice required. The case also stands as an indictment of certain interrogation practices that were common in the 1990s and that produced false confessions at a rate that is now well documented. The Reed technique, and similar high-pressure interrogation approaches, were used routinely during this period and are now understood to be particularly likely to produce false confessions from young people, from people with cognitive vulnerabilities, from people who have been subjected to extended interrogation sessions, from people who are told, falsely, that cooperation will produce lenience and that resistance is futile. Christopher Tapp was 19 years old. He was interrogated multiple times over multiple hours. The pressure applied to him was substantial. And he eventually said what the investigators seemed to want him to say, in the way that human beings under extreme psychological pressure sometimes do, not because it was true but because the pressure demanded something. The reform of interrogation practices in American law enforcement has been ongoing since cases like Tapp's entered the public record, but it has been slow and uneven. Some jurisdictions have adopted mandatory recording of all interrogations, which creates accountability and documentation that helps courts evaluate whether a confession was genuinely voluntary. Others have moved toward interrogation techniques that are less coercive and more likely to produce reliable information. The progress is real but incomplete, and the lesson of Christopher Tapp's case has not been fully absorbed everywhere it needs to be. Angie Dodge was 18 years old. She had just started building her independent life in her own apartment in Idaho Falls. She was murdered by a neighbor who lived across the street, a man who looked ordinary, who existed in the ordinary landscape of the neighborhood without anyone knowing what he was. He came into her apartment, he did what he did, and he went home. And then he watched from across the street as the investigation began and eventually moved in a different direction entirely. She deserved better from the justice system that was supposed to find her killer. She deserved an investigation that followed the evidence where it led, that did not allow the pressure for closure to override the obligation to get it right, that treated the DNA evidence with the seriousness it deserved from the beginning. If the DNA had been followed from the start, if the investigation had not fixed on Tapp in a way that created tunnel vision and led to coerced confession, then 2 decades of a man's life might have been saved and a killer might have been imprisoned before he had the opportunity to watch, from across the street, as everything went wrong in a way that benefited only him. There is something important to say about the way the case was ultimately resolved that goes beyond the mechanics of genetic genealogy and the details of the investigation. The resolution was possible because Carol Dodge refused to stop. It was possible because attorneys and advocates who believed in Christopher Tapp's innocence kept fighting. Brian Leigh Dripps is in prison for the rest of his life. He will die there. Whatever he had, whatever life he constructed in the years between 1996 and his arrest, whatever ordinary existence he maintained while Angie Dodge was dead and Christopher Tapp was in prison, it is over. The law eventually reached him. The science eventually found him. The truth that he must have believed he had buried permanently turned out to be recoverable. Christopher Tapp is free. He is fully exonerated. His name has been cleared in the formal legal sense, which matters, though it cannot restore what was taken. He has spoken publicly about his experience, about the years in prison, about what it means to have had his innocence confirmed. His story is part of the ongoing national conversation about wrongful convictions, about interrogation reform, about the responsibility of the criminal justice system to get things right rather than simply to close cases. And Angie Dodge, 18 years old, in her first apartment, in Idaho Falls, Idaho, on the night of June 13, 1996, is the center of it all. She is the person around whom every other element of this story orbits. Her death set everything in motion. Her killer's identity was the truth that the system failed to find for 23 years. Her DNA evidence was the thread that ultimately unraveled the wrong conviction and pointed to the right man. Her mother's refusal to accept injustice was the human force that kept the case alive long enough for the technology to catch up. She deserved justice in 1996. She deserved it in 1998 when the wrong man was convicted in her name. She deserved it every year in between when the right man was free and the wrong man was imprisoned and the case existed in the perverse condition of being officially solved when it was actually anything but. She got something resembling justice in 2020, 24 years after she was killed, when the man who raped and stabbed her in her own apartment finally entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to the prison term that should have been his decades earlier. 24 years is a long time to wait for something that should have been found by following the evidence that was there from the beginning. It is a long time for a mother to fight a system that had already decided it had the answer. It is a long time for an innocent man to spend in a prison cell. It is a long time for a killer to be free. The case of Angie Dodge is not just a true crime story. It is a lesson in what the justice system owes to victims and to the accused and to the truth, and in what happens when those obligations are not met. It is a lesson that Idaho Falls learned at an enormous cost, and that the broader criminal justice system in America is still in the process of absorbing. Her name was Angie Dodge. She was 18 years old. She lived in Idaho Falls, Idaho. She had her own apartment and her whole life ahead of her, and none of it turned out the way it should have, not for her, not for the young man wrongly convicted in her name, not for her mother who spent 2 decades fighting for justice in 2 directions at once. The story of what happened to her and what happened because of it deserves to be remembered completely, and not just as a curiosity or a footnote in the history of forensic science, but as a full and serious accounting of what it costs when the system fails and what it takes to bring the truth to light.